Hello, everyone, and welcome to ONC's USCDI, HL7 FHIR, US Core, C-CDA, ONC Certification Tech Forum session. My name is Carmela Couder, and I work in the Standards Division at ONC, and my team has responsibility for USCDI. We have a great set of speakers lined up for you today. I'm going to ask that you enter your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the questions, and either I'll find an appropriate place in the presentations to ask the question as we go along, or in some cases, one of our presenters will be answering your questions directly in the chat, or we'll read them at the end. So let's get started. I'll let each speaker introduce themselves, and Al Taylor, take it away.
Thanks, Carmela. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Al Taylor. I'm a medical informatics officer in the Office of Technology within ONC. And as Carmela said, I'm in the terminology branch of the Standards Division. And I'm going to be talking about USCDI version 4, a little bit about version 5, and then we're going to talk. I'm going to hand it off to our certification team to talk about how USCDI works in the certification program. And that's the first thing I want to talk about is what, for those who don't know, I don't know that there's anyone who doesn't know, but USCDI is at its base a core set of data, and that is the data that's needed for facilitating patient care and patient access to their health data. In addition to being a defined set of data needed for exchange, it also establishes a baseline set of data that can be used for other purposes. We have some examples of how some other federal programs reference USCDI as the base standard, even though it's not part of the ONC regulation. They still use it as a standard reference to define the data requirements for their programs. And then another key feature of USCDI is that it expands over time. We currently are in an annual update cycle, so we publish a new version every year. And that is that update cycle, along with how do we get to what goes into a new version, is intentionally an open, predictable, and most importantly, collaborative process with the public. You could almost think about it as a crowdsourced standard. It's really intentional. It's intentionally designed that way so that the public can have a lot of input into what comes next in USCDI. USCDI was established in 2020 with the ONC Cures Act final rule. It is the required data set for a number of different ONC certification criteria, and Scott Gohan and Aaron Little are going to talk more in detail about how the certification program uses USCDI. And I mentioned some of the federal programs that use USCDI as a reference, including the CMS patient access and peer-to-payer APIs use USCDI as a standard reference. One thing to note is ONC is in the process of publishing our new certification and health IT rule, nickname HTI1. This rule proposes to remove one of the certification criteria, to amend one of the certification criteria. That's the electronic case reporting, the criterion. Remove the reference for USCDI. Should HTI1 be adopted as written, it would no longer require USCDI be the defined standard for the ECR, for that ECR criteria. Again, it's still not finalized yet, but that's how it was proposed, and so that may actually come to pass. This transparent, predictable, collaborative process has resulted in USCDI versions developing over time, adding new sets of data elements and data classes that address some shifting needs in health IT, not only adding data elements that seem to be missing, that might be missing from what most would consider to be a core set, but also other data that specifically addresses a number of different ONC policy priorities, including addressing health equity, addressing the needs of the underserved, and also addressing, when we published V4, we also added some data elements that address behavioral health data needs as well. And so this is just the progression of the versions, and the process continues. We're currently working on the next version of USCDI, which is draft USCDI version 5. This is a graphic of the update cycle. This is the current cycle, the 2023-2024 cycle. And the reason that we mention the cycle by date and not by version is because at any given time, 2 or more versions may be in various stages of development. We published version 4, which we're talking about today, in July, and immediately started the process to gather input for what would go into USCDI version 5. After the comment period closed in September, ONC began the process of sorting through all of the comments, all of the submissions for new data elements, comments on old data elements, comments on or submissions for new data elements to decide what needs to go into to USCDI. We expect to publish version 5 in January, and once we publish draft V5, once we publish draft V5, we will begin another period of public feedback on what got put into USCDI. Did we get definitions right? Did we select the right set of data elements? And how other things may need to change as well. And then once we process all of that feedback, we work on preparing the final version of USCDI version 5, which we hope to do in July of next year. I'm going to talk just briefly about the comment period. We talked about that in the last slide. I talked about it in the last slide. We received about 350 comments on existing data elements in USCDI from every walk of health IT. Everyone who's interested in health IT submitted some comments, and this is just one way to break down the comments, breaking down by the data classes that we received comments on. And in addition to the comments, these are comments on data elements that existed in version 4 or earlier. We also got 60 plus submissions through the ONDEX system, our data element submission system. And we're working on evaluating all of those submissions for new data elements and putting them all into consideration for future versions of USCDI. I mentioned some of the reasons why we add data elements to USCDI. We've defined these prioritization criteria. The top 4 are what I consider to be policy priorities, including disparities and inequities, underserved communities, behavioral health, and public health reporting. The other criteria that we use to select amongst the data elements for addition to USCDI include some technical criteria or technical priorities, really centered around picking data that is reasonably expected to be able to be integrated into health IT appropriately. Sometimes it's already being used. Sometimes it needs some technical development in order to be represented in health IT, and then to be adopted into the implementation guides that are used to exchange USCDI data. And then, of course, we have to consider that the data elements that we add to USCDI have to be, as a package, needs to be a reasonable amount of change for health IT developers, standards developers like the HL7 teams that we're going to hear from today, and as well as providers and other members of the healthcare system that have to take those and actually put them into practice. These are the 20 data elements that we added in USCDI version 4. It included one new data class on facility information. It also included continued expansion of the medications data class and the laboratory data class, and added several new health status assessments. One of the areas in the goals and preferences was an area that we expanded into, and that was intended to gather information or patient information that is used to inform the overall advanced care planning process, such as preparation of advanced directives, living wills, durable power of attorneys. These are two components of that process, and that was sort of new ground that ONC dove into by adding these data elements. And then the medication data elements that we added are intended to gather information about the kind of the whole picture of what a patient is taking medicine-wise, not just what's prescribed, but what they're actually taking it, what they're actually taking, how they're taking, and whether or not they're skipping doses or whether or not they're taking anything else like over-the-counter medications. So that was an attempt to start getting more to the root of the data that's involved with medication reconciliation. And we also add, obviously the other ones are here. I'm not just going to go into every one of them. This is USCDI version 4 in total, and this is available on the website, and these are just an indicator of what we added. In some cases, we moved or renamed some data elements as well, and those are indicated here on the slide as well. When we published version 4, we also made some changes and to hopefully streamline the process, or at least make it more understandable, so that people can provide a higher impact, more meaningful contributions or more meaningful submissions that really get to what they want to see change in USCDI, and to help ONC interpret what they want for consideration for new versions.
Hey, Al, before we go into this next section, we have a question about one of the USCDI version 4 data elements, if you don't mind going back a couple slides.
Okay.
So the question in the chat is, why is procedure performance time a public health data element, related data element?
Well, that's one reason why it was submitted. It was submitted by our CDC counterparts, our colleagues, and it is used to represent not just sort of a surgical procedure that might be done in a clinic, but it can also represent other interventions like immunization. So the timing of an immunization, timing of a medication administration can be captured, can be used in that using that data element. It's listed in the procedures data class, but it can be used to modify or to provide additional information for anything that's done on behalf of the patient.
Thank you.
Anything else, or should I go on there? So when we also, like I said, we also made some changes to USCDI, so the on-deck process, and centered around making it easier for people to get higher impact submission. We added a search feature last year, so that people can see if other people have submitted something, so that hopefully to reduce the chances that somebody submits a duplicate, a data element that has already been considered, possibly even already considered for addition for USCDI. And in that case, they don't have to, because we're not going to add two data elements that mean the same thing, that do the same thing. And so this search function is used and can be used, and we're working on continuing to make that process more effective. We also added a page where we talk specifically about the leveling criteria that are used to define, so that a submitter who wants a new data element can have a reasonable understanding about a reasonable expectation about what ONC will do with that data element and how it's likely to get leveled. The reason the level is important is because ONC, we provide these levels to identify which of them maybe need some more work, maybe need to be scoped in such a way to make them most broadly applicable, or maybe some additional standards development, some testing or piloting might need to be done for these. And in order to, so these are the ones that are going to be the most readily implementable or can be added to USCDI, and then ultimately integrated into regular into clinical practice as far as capturing and exchanging the data. We also the level 0 is one. It's a little bit of a hybrid level because it identifies two things. One, it identifies data elements that are technically immature. They may not have an implementation guide. They're not already represented using FHIR or CDA. They may only apply to a very narrow sector of healthcare or a specialty or specific healthcare setting. And those are the ones that are, there's a group of them that fall into each of those categories where they're determined to be level 0 and therefore not considered for USCDI. If things change over time, if there's more use cases identified to make them more applicable to more settings, then we would consider bumping it up to a higher level and then possibly considering it for USCDI. But if it's still technically mature or only applies to a narrow use case, then that data element is not going to be considered for USCDI at this time. And then we also made some changes to the submission form that people use. They have to fill in to apply for a new data element for consideration, and that includes changing the way that we ask the questions about a data element. So instead of describe the data element, excuse me for 1 second. Instead of just describing the data element, which a lot of times results in a fairly long narrative, we're asking for a more concise definition. This would be the definition that's used when we publish the data element and consider it for USCDI. I'm going to now turn it over to Scott Bohan and Aaron Little to talk about the ONC certification and how the certification uses USCDI. So I'm going to flip slides for Scott, but I'm going to turn it over to him. Scott, take it away.
Great, thanks, Al. I'm going to turn it over first to Erin, and she can present the first part, and then I'll present the second part.
All right, thanks, Al and Scott. So my name is Erin Little. I am a public health analyst, and I am in the Office of Technology at ONC in the Certification and Testing Vision and Tools and Testing branch. Just a brief blurb about the certification program. And so it's a voluntary program established by ONC for the certification of health IT. A variety of standards, implementations, specifications, and certification criteria establish the specific requirements for certification. And one of those standards is USCDI. And so USCDI advances interoperable data exchange for certified health IT by specifying a common set of data classes and elements. And Al just kind of went through some of those earlier. And this was adopted in the ONC Cures Act final rule for use in the certification program. And so currently, the certification criteria that has support for USCDI in our certification program are B1, transitions of care, B2, clinical information reconciliation and incorporation, E3, to view, download, and transmit to a third party, F5, transmission to public health agencies, and electronic case reporting, just a brief note about that, as Al mentioned earlier, this is a current requirement under version 1, but if adopted in HTI 1, F5 would no longer require USCDI. Also, we have G9, which is application access, all data request, and G10, standardized API for patient and population services. Next slide. So one of the cool things that we have is the standards version advancement process. And so because we work hand in hand with industry, we want to make sure that we are supporting interoperability with some flexibility. So as things change, we'd like to keep up with those changes through the standards version advancement process. Certified health IT developers that are participating in the certification program can voluntarily update their health IT modules to updated versions of standards prior to adoption and regulations. This is not something that you have to do, but if there is an updated standard that has gone through the SFAP, you can then update so you don't have to wait for this to be adopted in regulation. As we know, sometimes this can take a while. So this gives you some flexibility in that. There are some limitations. This is limited to standards that are adopted in the certification criteria that meet the real world testing condition and maintenance of certification requirement. Each year, ONC collaborates with stakeholders and elicits public comment in the process to identify and approve newer standards that are ready for adoption. And so at the bottom is just a little picture that kind of shows the general process. So from January until May of 2023, that was our SBAC comment period where people could come in and look at the newer standards and make comments and then approve the ones that are ready for adoption. July 2023 was the SFAP announcement for those particular standards that have been approved. And then September 2023, they are effective. So next slide shows the approved SFAP standards for 2023. There were a total of 6 standards that are approved for SFAP in 2023. 3 specifically are related to USCDI and were available for voluntary certification beginning on September 11th of this year. So that would be USCDI version 3, HL7 FHIR US Core Implementation Guide 6.1.0, and HL7 CDA R2 Implementation Guide, the C-CDA Templates for Clinical Notes Companion Guide Release 4.1. And I will hand it over to Scott for the second half of our presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Hello, I am Scott Bohan. I work at ONC in the Tools and Testing branch, and here today to talk about testing in the ONC certification program. So as mentioned earlier, the ONC certification program includes criteria which require support for USCDI. For example, the B1 transition of care criterion requires support for the creation of a transition of care or referral summary document, including the USCDI data classes. And another example is the G10 standardized API for patient and population services criterion, which requires support for FHIR APIs, which can respond to requests for USCDI data for a single patient or multiple patients. So when a health IT developer certifies a module to criteria requiring support for USCDI, the module must undergo the appropriate level of certification testing. And this testing verifies that the module supports technical requirements within the criterion. And the details of how a module is tested for a criterion are contained in that criterion's test procedure. And test procedure steps are often actualized using a testing tool. For example, the Edge testing tool and the Inferno testing tool are used as are examples of testing tools which support USCDI related certification testing. Next slide, please. So to provide context for the certification testing discussion, this slide illustrates an example of a criterion which requires support for USCDI, the G10 criterion. So the G10 standardized API for patient and population services criterion is designed such that provider systems containing USCDI data can be made accessible via FHIR APIs. So one API for individual patient data and another API for bulk data access. And specific FHIR implementation guides define the requirements for those APIs, including US Core and bulk data access implementation guides. Additionally, these APIs also are required to have a security layer for app authorization. And this security layer is designed around the OAuth 2.0 standard, so app authorization to access data is done in a secure manner. And then consumer and system apps can then use these secure FHIR APIs to access clinical data from providers. So these technical features and support for standards that we just went over in a criterion form requirements that are tested as part of certification. We can go to the next slide. All right, so now we can discuss the testing workflow. So on the left-hand side is where we start with the requirements, and the requirements overall come from the intended use case, which in the context of the certification program come from criterion requirements. For example, the G10 requirements that we just discussed on the previous slide. So criterion requirements may be a combination of support for reference standards and other enumerated requirements mentioned in the criterion. All right, so now that we have defined the requirements as part of that step one, next are the conformance artifacts. And these artifacts serve as a benchmark or reference point and include things like first a reference server, which is an implementation of the set requirements that serves as a reference for other systems trying to meet conformance. Second, the reference data, which is data conformant to those requirements and may populate the reference server. And then third are the conformance tests, which are used by a testing tool to show a system is conformant to the requirements. And then the next step here, the testing tool, such as Inferno, may contain all of these testing artifacts to support testing system conformance. And then lastly, the test tool usually generates a results report, which informs the tester about a system's compliance to tested requirements. Next slide, please. And so these next few slides will show some examples of some testing artifacts related to certification testing. And so on this slide, it's a picture of the landing page for the test kit for the G10 criterion that's used as part of certification testing. So on the left is a description of the test kit, and on the right are the standards options available for testing in the test kit. And the standards available to be selected include both the base regulatory standards as well as optional standards available through the standards version advancement process. Next slide, please. Right, so then after selecting those standards that are going to be tested, this slide is a picture of the Inferno testing interface that's started on starting a testing session. And so within a testing session, a user can see a detailed description of the available tests, run tests against an API, and generate a results report. And at the bottom of the testing interface are links to the test kit source code and a link to report any issues discovered within the test kit. And then if we go to the next slide, this slide is showing an example of part of a testing report generated by the Inferno G10 test kit. And this report includes things such as the test input parameters and the status of the tests that were run. And we can go to the next slide. And I believe that concludes this portion of the presentation. I'll pass it over to Brett for the next part of the presentation.
Hi, this is Carmela. If I may just jump in for a second. There's been some questions in the chat and the Q&A about certification, and Erin and Scott will be answering those right in the chat or the Q&A section. Thanks.
Great.
All right. Thank you, Erin and Scott and Al and Carmela. So we're on to the standards portion of the talk, and I will try to peek at questions a bit as we go, but I know trying to go too fast here. So just a quick agenda check here. So we'll talk a little about how USCDI fits into the HL7 standards development process. I'll talk about how US Core is kind of the baseline standard enabling USCDI and FHIR, and then C-CDA enabling USCDI on the CDA standard. So I'm Brett Marquardt, principal of Wave 1, background in kind of EHR development implementation, have been fortunate to be involved in the development of US Core since the beginning, and C-CDA. And on the C-CDA side, get some support from the Federal Electronic Health Record Modernization Program, the FHIR, which builds industry standards to support their federal partners. But in all things standards, and it's everything's a community effort here, and so it's you have Gay Dolan and Eric Haas, and if you listed all kind of the vendors and providers and patient advocates who have commented and made these standards what they are. It would fill the slide deck. And so for folks who, I see there's 400 folks on the phone, we're about to release a standard here in December. That's going to go to ballot. You're all invited to comment. We can put links at the end. HL7 is an open process, and the standards are only as good as folks who are testing and providing real feedback and then sharing that with the editing community. Okay, so you've seen USCDI as kind of the standard set of data classes for interoperable exchange. We view USCDI a little bit different, and there's a little bit of, I don't want to say it's tension, it's a friendly tug of war, in that we see USCDI as a bit of data policy, and that it's standards agnostic, and that USCDI puts a few little nuggets in there that says, hey, use SNOMED or use LOINC or UCOM or USAT, but it doesn't take it all the way to say, hey, this is what it's actually going to look like on the wire when you generate an instance. It doesn't give any use cases to go with it, and USCDI is very important. That is a floor for standardization. We're not setting the bar of what we would like everyone to achieve. We're setting the floor of what you can build on top of. And many vendors, when you look at what their FHIRs publish, when you look at their published FHIR support, go well beyond USCDI, and sometimes are even implementing data elements that are in USCDI 4 or 5 kind of draft, or because the customer is requested or meets a specific need. And so the whole idea is, we see USCDI as the place that for everyone to build on top of. So to go with that, can't help but put a first quick screenshot of US Core 6.1.0 that was published this summer, and that gives guidance for USCDI version 3. And you'll see we have some friendly frogs that you'll hear throughout. I don't know, I guess there's a few pictures here. We hop over each other. And so when Al showed that picture of USCDI being a January draft, a July final, ONC has kind of set the policy that July, but the standards haven't fully been built yet to meet that kind of policy objective. And so we joked that frog is jumping over, the USCDI frog has jumped over US Core, and then US Core goes through a development cycle that kicks off in the summer. And so we're currently doing design work for USCDI version 4. We've been doing that work. Actually, we started earlier, so we started in May with the idea that there's kind of a ballot in the winter timeframe, and then there's publication in, I say spring, April, May of 2024 for that next release. So why does this matter? I know you saw us mentioned earlier, but these standards, US Core and C-CDA later in the CURES rule is named for systems who choose to be certified. And also in the latest HGI 1, included in the proposed rule, For folks who are looking at future ONC agendas, a plug for the annual meeting. I have no stake in the annual meeting except to say that if you look at the agenda, there's some good looking policy overview things. And so fingers crossed that HCI 1 is out by then. Maybe it'll be Christmas, or holiday season, but I'm hoping that by annual meeting, I could say that. I have no idea. Don't take any of my advice on that as gospel. But 6.1.0 was named or actually 6.0 was named, that's what was published at the time. But then 6.1 was then SFAP, and so the expectation is when HCI 1 is published, that ONC would consider the latest and greatest. And again, I have to be careful. I'm not speaking for ONC. I have no idea what ONC is actually going to do here, but optimistic, of course. Okay, so how does US Core enable USCDI? The first thing is, for folks who are familiar with this HL7 standard FHIR, it's really hard to believe it's been around for 10 years. But when it first came out, there was a belief that you didn't need to have kind of discrete profiles or definitions on exactly how you use the FHIR model, the resources within FHIR. You could just exchange your conformance or capability statement with the client and the server, and then you'd be able to interoperate, and life would be good. And you'd populate what you know, and that'd be good enough. And we learned pretty quickly that systems, even with the strong definitions in the FHIR standard, the resources are huge, and so profile-less FHIR is not enough to enable true interoperability. And so the idea that we have to have kind of constrained profiles became evident very quickly. And that is part of what US Core fulfills. And so a quick example here is in the base condition resource. So condition resource is used to track, to help support exchange of the problem lists or diagnoses. And so in here, you'll see a bunch of elements, and some are very important pieces, but maybe not all necessary for the just exchange of a simple problem list or active problems. And so you take this, and one example within here is on the condition.code. It has this thing called an example binding. And for folks who want to get deep into standards, you can join us, but just humor us for a minute. Is the example binding just says, hey, you should have a code here, but doesn't say whether it needs to be SNOMED or ICD 9 or 10 or what would actually go here. And so the idea of a profile in US Core gives further definition of what exactly should go in that particular element. And so you'll see this is we just jumped to the US Core condition profile. You see this in the spec, and you'll see that we have a requirement for a data is asserted, the clinical status of whether it's active or interactive or relapsed or verification status, and in the particular category, and then a code. And in this particular code, we have condition code, which is extensible, which allows kind of for SNOMED, ICD-10, or other things if for some reason there isn't a concept available, and a whole bunch of detail could be added here. But the idea of the profile is that it gives further constraint. Oh, and here you go, calling out the condition code here. Okay, so it's really important when we talk about US Core. Originally, I won't go into the full history of it, but it came out of this HL7 accelerator, which is kind of before it was an accelerator, called the Argonaut project, which is a mix of EHR tech vendors, providers, and consumer app developers that came together to say, hey, how do we enable open API access to clinical servers and EHRs? And so the US Core implementation guide incorporates the learnings from the Argonaut DSQ2 guide. So if you're out in industry today and you end up working with a FHIR server that's using DSQ2, FHIR DSQ2, US Core has upgraded to the latest version, FHIR R4, and has incorporated all those Argonaut requirements. And the original version, that was published and named was 3.1.1, and we've kind of continued to roll from there. it's more than just USCDI. So the kind of the first reaction folks have when they open up US Core is that they say, hey, there are requirements in here that are not an exact match to USCDI. And that's because when you start to look at, let's just, I could show this in the guide later, but when you look at patient, something as common as the patient MRN or patient identifier may not be called out in USCDI, but is pretty critical for exchange between systems. And so we've added that requirement. And so US Core kind of builds on it and expands it a bit. Of course, has to include all the pieces of USCDI, but expands on it a bit to enable interoperability. And so there was a project even before US Core and the data access framework. I can't help but mention that even preceded some of the Argonaut work. Okay, so where are we today? We are actually all the way up to US Core 6.1.0. The process, kind of mentioned as, reviewing USCDI requirements, developing a guide, and then submitting to ballot. The last ballot received over 100 trackers through the HL7 Jira tracking system. We published in early May at 6.0, and then got some feedback that the 6.0 needed some improvement on the sex guidance to use SNOMED. And so we did a rapid kind of release of an errata 6.1.0 to include that. And so if you're to follow that link at hl7.org/US Core, you would find the latest guide. So inside that specification, we spent a lot of time to try to help folks who, for folks who are experienced, they jump in and have no problem navigating the spec. But we've continued to try to improve the readability of that spec. And so there is a direct mapping from the USCDI data classes and elements. And so on the left-hand side, the USCDI elements, and then the right-hand side, an actual link within the spec to those profiles. There's a lot of terminology in the spec to align with USCDI. Some of them you'll find are directly in the spec. Others link out to something called the Value Set Authority Center, which allows you to download those whole value sets. In terms of really a quick snapshot of how does USCDI relate to US Core version, you could see that version 1 was released. There were 2 versions of US Core to support it, 3.1.1 and 4.0. For folks who want to know the nitty-gritty on that, you can there's an innocent phrase called must support of what a system is required to support if they well, I won't even try to summarize what must support means in 2 sentences. But our 3.1.1 release included kind of a fair bit of ambiguity of what systems were required to support. And so we provide a lot of guidance and improve that guidance in 4.0 and worked very closely with HL7, the vendor community, and the certification tooling community to make sure it was very clear on what folks would be tested. And that's where the 4.0 release came into play. And then V2, was in 5.0.1 clean release. And then again, V3 was published at the end of June this year. And this is a big picture, and I'll try to, I've kind of said this verbally, but now you can stare at it. Maybe it will sink in here. Is that ONC is on this cycle of, in the January timeframe, publishing their draft. I actually liked Al's big wheel. So they're things are always kind of in flight. They have the draft here, and then the final, and then we don't have it here, but of course ONC is working on the next round of USCDI version 5, which we look forward to receiving in the new year. And we, just to give a little bit of thinking on this, we, at one point, a few years back, we thought, could we do standards development in parallel with the USCDI, ONC's USCDI development process? And, ONC is, spends a fair bit, takes a fair bit of care in getting, very clear definitions, good solid terminology. And the idea of trying to develop against something that hasn't been finalized, we looked at it as a kind of industry community, and the level of rework that would be necessary seemed quite high. And so, after kind of actually even communicating with ONC in this, have decided that the ballot process and the kind of formalization into an HL7 standard for US Core and C-CDA would be delayed 1 cycle. And so the publication of USCDI is here. The kind of industry testing, piloting, getting prepped for ballot is going on throughout the kind of rest of the year. And then there's a ballot submission in December. And then going into 2024 here, that ballot has occurred. And the ballot process in HL7 is it's open for comment for 30 days. There's no, pencils are down, no editing. The feedback comes in, and then we go through that reconciliation of responding to every single comment in a public forum with formal voting and process. It's a lot of fun. And then the formal publication, again, is kind of late May, June, which has been, convenient to line up nicely with ONC's SVAP process. So that's a high-level timeline. I'm just going to peek for a second, see if there's any questions here. Okay. All right, we'll keep going and seeing in chat. Okay, so what's the takeaway from the last 15 minutes here? So US Core does not directly equal USCDI, okay? And one of the ways, if you're wearing an ONC hat, you think, or maybe an HL7 hat when you do a new ballot, is that HL7 is a little bit bigger than USCDI. So when we submit for ballot this fall, we'll look at all of USCDI version 4. We'll make sure everything that's in there, every data element, data class has a clear definition, and we'll add the necessary kind of maybe other requirements in the standard to make sure that they're interoperable. But after we submit that ballot in December, ONC, of course, is going to publish a new version of USCDI in draft form. And so immediately after that, the ONC's USCDI is a little bit bigger. And sometimes I say a little, maybe that's an optimistic wish that it'd be a little bit, but the pattern is 15 to 25-ish data elements. And so when ONC publishes that, there's a moment where the ONC USCDI is again bigger than US Core. And so we're kind of constantly in this leapfrog game of, new, government policy requirements, new industry standard. And then, of course, there's an adoption cycle besides this also. But it's been a pretty healthy pattern in terms of getting new requirements and working through the HL7 community process. So we'll go a little bit deeper here just to look at one profile here, patient demographics, and how it maps to US Core. So it's pretty clear the ONC data classes aren't necessarily in any way meant to match directly to kind of a FHIR resource. But in this case, the patient USCDI's patient demographics maps to the FHIR resource patient. And so we start with the patient. And so then we look at this and say, hey, what elements do we actually need to support? And so in this case, I call it identifier earlier, and that something may not be an ONC USCDI requirement, but it's important for exchange. And in some cases, there are elements in the base resource. So this particular resource patient, there may be things that the international standards community doesn't include in the base resource. And race, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, those aren't things that are universally accepted around the world. And so they're not included in the base kind of FHIR resource. And so we use these things called extensions to add things that aren't included in the international standard. And so we've had to add a few of those to patient. There aren't very many in the spec, but there are definitely a few there. And so once those are defined, we also spend a lot of time on terminology. And so you'll see any spot where there's this binding, then there's a value set, which is a set of concepts that is allowed at that spot. And on each profile page, and this is evolved over time a fair bit. We have tried to be very clear about what each patient must have, and that means every instance is expected to have this. And then the idea of must support. The expectation is that your system is able to include this when you have it. And so if I give you a birth date and an address for a patient, you will be able to include it. And then we have this thing called additional USCDI requirements. And so these are, if you're doing certification and the certification community at Inferno or Touchstone, you are required to prove that you can capture and exchange release. So essentially it makes all these must support. There's an interesting dance going on here between must support and additional USCDI. If you're just on this call, you might think, why didn't you just mark them all must support? That would have been more clear. And we did that in some of the early releases. But it's important to reflect that US Core, well, it's used for ONC certification. It's also meant to be a kind of foundational standard at in the HL7 US community. And so any guide that is built at HL7 that has a US realm component, or is kind of called or tagged US realm, is required to build on US Core 1 at 10. And we got strong feedback from public health community, quality community, payment community, that some of these elements, sex, race, ethnicity, weren't things they could require for their use case. And so we thought long and hard about whether we'd split US Core and have even like a simplified kind of US realm spec, a base spec, and then a core spec, and how that would all work. And we thought we would try to keep it in one and make it clear. And if that exploded, then we would kind of split it out. But there's a fair bit of convenience in terms of keeping things consistent and kind of a consistent look and feel if there's one editing team. And so for now, we have stuck with the idea that a few key things are, you got to have them, a few are must support, and then there's a bunch of things that are there for folks who are interested in being certified in ONC's certification program. On the page, there is an introductory section. It's tricky. It's hard with narrative text. We know developers, our experiences, examples are key. Testable conformance is key. And so we try to make sure as much of it is machine processable. We do sometimes have to put text in there. And so on that profile page, you'll see some profile specific implementation guidance. You see this about name, suffix, and previous address, about, hey, here are kind of how you can indicate a previous name or a previous address by setting use to old and providing the end date in address if that end date is actually known, because sometimes you don't know when that address is no longer relevant. Or something like Social Security, we know those are not a wise choice in patient identifiers. And so we say, hey, we know some folks have used these in the past, but you shouldn't, that's not a value we recommend for the patient identifier field. And I'll show a profile here in a moment, but at the bottom of the profile page is this kind of quick start section. The FHIR API, the kind of RESTful search API, is incredibly powerful. And when we first started on this journey, you can kind of string together a whole bunch of parameters on some really nice kind of fun queries. And the Happy server out there and Graham Greaves reference server can support those. And when we started talking with some of the existing EHR servers out there, what their plans are support, we learned very quickly that they weren't, they didn't have kind of business cases or needs or customer requests to support all those queries. But they were very clear, hey, there's a limited set that we're happy to consistently support. Get a patient by ID or get a patient by their MRN. These are, maybe even look up by name. And so what we agreed to do is on each of those profile pages, be very clear about the specific RESTful searches that the EHRs will support. And then this allows them certification to them to be tested that they can perform those. And also sets very clear expectations for folks who are doing client, app development, how they can access information. And then just a quick view, on this is there are two screenshots here on value sets or kind of vocab terminology in the spec, and there's maybe a little bit of a jump here, but for folks who read the spec in detail, you see there's kind of two types of value sets. There's one kind of compositional where the value set is built by saying, hey, from SNOMED is this type of concept. So this is a value set where it's a concept is a clinical finding, is an event, and can include all ICD-10 and ICD-9. And is a very large value set for someone to access, but it's compositionally defined. And then also in the spec, we have this thing called enumerated value sets, where we often link out to VSAC. And so inside the smoking status profile, you can link out and see the specific concepts that are called out that were expected for systems to support. So they're fully enumerated. We go back and forth over time about whether directly including value sets in the spec versus in VSAC. Our current push for this release is we really want to share things with C-CDA, because C-CDA is another standard for exchange, has similar requirements to enable USCDI, and the terminology for that is common in 99% of cases. And so we want to make sure that we're using shared value sets. And so VSEC has been a very good tool for us to do that. And we really appreciate MLM providing support for us to put our value sets there. Another part of the spec is these things called capability statements. And so this particular part of the page or particular part of the spec gives discrete expectations of what the FHIR server is going to be capable of. So if someone says they're a US Core FHIR server, asserting they can communicate, hey, I support these specific profiles. Here's the queries I support. I support include or rev include or different kind of FHIR features at different spot. And the idea is we give an example capability statement in the spec. It's the expectation is that folks who are implementing take the example US Core capability statement and update it to match the particular services that they're providing. We also have a client capability statement, just as kind of an FYI for clients who are interested in what they could declare and maybe post to the world to say, hey, here's what my current FHIR support is. And so just a few little kind of conformance expectation here. Again, looking at patient, it talks about the ability to search and the kind of supported search types. Those pages that you saw quick start, actually formalizing those to say, hey, I support by a logical ID, I support searching by a patient identifier or an MRN, support search by name. Here's some combination searches I support. And we're always kind of evaluating and adding to this list in each release. I think patient's probably pretty stable, but in others, as we introduce no new profiles, we're always thinking about what makes sense to kind of set the floor across the industry. So, here's an indicator of support profile, support searches. To go with that, we have the internal testing framework, which is incredibly powerful. The team that develops this, Yunwei, I could never thank him and Rob and others enough for the support they provided to US Core in terms of reading the spec. We talk about, for folks who do standards development, you talk about, getting like real live production feedback, improving your product. Standards developers who, you build your reference implementation, that's pretty good. But when you build a reference implementation and a testing framework and you bring together 5 other folks who've done the same thing and you start, playing together, connecting, you learn all kinds of stuff. And it's been, the value of, the community has provided to make the spec better is great. So we have had a whole bunch of formal Connect-a-thon events. I can't even remember how many we've had. I think our first ones were in 2015. We've had at least one a year for the last 8 years, sometimes several a year. Some of those hosted by us, kind of the editors, but more recently, we've had the support of the testing community running those. And again, provide feedback to the certification process at ONC, and of course, improve the spec. Okay, so what's next? USCDI version 4, Al showed it to you. We're working hard on it. So 20 new data elements were added. The standards bulletin for folks who, there's a link here that calls it out. If you click there, that is always the nice differential between the prior release of USCDI version 3 and version 4 is always the first thing I read. But the process, we're in flight to doing the design to improve to do a new release of US Core support USCDI. And I guess there's our frog. I think we're ahead of schedule here, and so I will just take maybe. Well, I guess at the end we talk about kind of design process, but maybe I'll just show a few things here very quickly, just to spec some of the things I've talked about, some handy things here. Just the first thing, it's handy I'm seeing is the directory published versions. You can, at the link on top of every page, you can click here and see what the versions are. And I always, start with 6.1.0. One incredible feature HL7 added this last, 2 months. Is if you want to quickly move between versions, you can just click between them. And so again, we're based on FHIR release 4, but the IG version has 6 different releases. And so one of the things that you can do is, let's just say you're looking at US Core patient. Oh, sorry, I'll go slower here. I'm here. We have the conformance page about general requirements most support. We have guidance. This is where that USCDI table lives. And each one of these is a link to the specific profile that defines it. And then underneath here, there's guidance on clinical notes. So there's a whole project on exposing clinical notes, guidance on medication lists, basic provenance, screening assessments. We're doing a fair bit of work to clarify. We're always kind of improving screening assessments as we learn more. And so there'll be some even more improvements in 7.0, changes between versions in the future of US Core. In terms of FHIR artifacts, this is where I went, profiles and extensions. And if you hop over into patient, and so in here, you'll see the kind of the similar, I'll zoom in a little bit. I know sometimes this is like maybe small on your Zoom screen, but you'll see this is the screenshot that was in the presentation where we had the kind of introductory matter, a little bit of implementation guidance, and then the discrete profile. You'll see this USCDI flag. So this is, there's going to be a slight change to the next release. Right now, everything is, anything that's must support or USCDI has this flag. We agreed in the next release that we're only going to flag things that aren't must support because certification is the merging of US Core and USCDI. And it doesn't make sense to flag them as both. And also it's confusing because some things like gender are no longer in USCDI. They're still must support in US Core, and it's really not appropriate to tag them as USCDI. And I say tag, it's not just in this visual view. If you were to go and look at the underlying JSON, so behind this is a formal structured definition that defines this. Hopefully that flips over to me. Why aren't you? There's something wrong with my browser here. Oh, there it is. It took. And so inside here, just to make sure folks see this, oops, make sure I can go down to here. I'll just hop into this structure definition. Up in here. So like if we were to go to where were we here? So we're in the start of the patient itself here. And so there actually is a flag in here to say, hey, patient extension race, and a kind of formalization to say, hey, this is a USCDI requirement. And so this allows tooling like Inferno, where folks are doing some kind of generation of their software to say, hey, I have to support this. And so this is, again, it's not just the visual, it's actually a kind of a structured flag underneath in the definition. And then underneath the profile itself is the quick start, where we have kind of the potential searches, the kind of required searches, and then optional searches. Could probably spend a whole lot more time going through this, but what I'll do is I'll pause and let Gay do a tour of C-CDA, and then we can maybe come back to this depending on how we are doing for time. So I will pause if Gay is ready to pull up the presentation.
I am. You wanna? Yep.
And as you're doing that, all.
Right. So, yeah, first of all, I wanted to apologize for my voice. And if I end up losing my voice or having a coughing fit, my dear friend and colleague, Brett, promised he would take over. So, and also let me put my video on. There we go. So I'm going to talk about both a little bit about the design, a little bit more about the design process, and it's very similar across both C-CDA and USCDI. In fact, the teams are cross-pollinated. My name is Gay Dolan, and I am principal of Namaste Informatics. I'm actually one of my main roles is as US Rome Program Manager. I'm a nurse by background, primarily in the NICU. I'm also Structured Documents Co-Chair. I did probably about 20 years of clinical practice, and now I'm 15 or more years in standards development, like Brett on the original C-CDA and even CCD when it was by itself, and also a terminologist. I play both, both the syntax role in standards development and the semantic role, which is the terminological role. And we are cross-pollinated with teams, which is great because, and more so as we've progressed over the years. Brett is on the C-CDA team as well. I'm on the US Core team. And we have added this time around Jean Duteau, Benjamin Fleschner, and Rosemary Hofstede because of, well, I'll be talking about later, we're changing our publication style in C-CDA to meet the 21st century. So that more on that later. C-CDA is, FHIR is, everyone I think recognizes that FHIR is really, the standard of the current and future, because it's so much more effective to use in terms of APIs and queries and access and little bits and pieces if you're not wanting to send around a whole document. But however, C-CDA is extremely prevalent in the industry right now. They're a last tick, which can be seen that these are just carry quality statistics. There's over 4.8 billion documents exchanged annually, which is about 400 million a month and 12 million a day, and that doesn't necessarily include the other exchanges that occur with outside of carry quality. So that it really is primarily, it's the common way that things are sent around, and it's going to be around for quite a long time, just like V2. In case folks don't know on the call, V2 is another HL7 standard that is primarily focused on, not wholly, but primarily focused on and highly used for sending the V2 lab messages around. And so we imagine that all three will exist for a while. So C-CDA on the CDA side, consolidated CDA, which is what C-CDA stands for, it enables USCDI. Here's our little froggy picture. We develop a USCDI states the elements every year annually, and together US Core and CCDA teams work together to clarify the definitions and and play along in that leapfrog game. Consolidated CDA has been around for quite some time. Originally in 2007, implementation guide called the Continuity of Care Document, or CCD, was first published independently outside of CCDA. And between the years of about 2007 and 2010, there were 10 or more common clinical document types published. So common clinical document types, meaning the kind of documents that are most frequently used in the clinical setting. So history and physical, operative note, procedure note, and with the addition of this, sort of all based on actually the CCD, which was, I used to describe it as the front sheet in an old paper chart that kind of gave you the overall glimpse. And honestly, that was how it was intended, but of course it grew over the years. In 2011, we realized we'd created a bunch of different guides, and they needed to be put into one guide to be able to encourage reuse and to, just because you have say how to represent problems in a progress note isn't going to be different than how you represent problems from a structural standards perspective than it would be in a discharge summary. Kept them several versions, 4 companion guides, and many errata later it grew and grew, and to where we are today. And so what we then, because C-CDA is kind of a challenging format, it's produced out of a tooling that produces Word documents, and they get transformed to PDF documents. And it's a big, huge 1,000-page document. We decided that in order to represent extra guidance for implementers and back in the day when we had Meaningful Use 1 and 2, we started then developing companion guides. So guides that reused C-CDA templates and also then provided guidance with respect to the data elements that were being requested to be sent around by ONC. In here, the original one provided guidance on additional guidance over the base standard, and provided extra implementer information that we realized was missing in that original guide that was frequently identified by something kind of sort of like the FHIR implementation-a-thons that occur. We call them C-CDA implementation-a-thons, where folks initially were seeing, well, here's how we're producing our guides, producing our CDAs. Do they look right? Do they look accurate? Are they compliant? And comparing it with other vendors. And we still hold those today, and they have different varying themes. But anyway, the companion guides then point to CDA templates and say where the meaningful use and or USCDI data elements are represented. And initially, the first one, release 1 and 1.1, covered meaningful use 1 and 2, but added no new templates. And then, as the USCDI sort of the USCDI concept of USCDI was developed, and the annual updates and releases, we then used companion guides to represent them as well. And so we have companion guides 2 through 4 that represent USCDI 1 through 3. So again, we bolster the standard and add implementation guidance. We provide mapping in some cases. In some cases, it was just a, hey, yeah, this thing's existed for a long time, and by the way, here's where it's represented in CDA. And so in several cases, in many cases, we also added additional templates. Sometimes they were just derived or conformed to an existing templates, adding things like vocabularies and some additional requirements. And other times they were completely new. So you can see this layer cake thing. Probably there's some people on the call that haven't even heard of HL7 version 3. Well, HL7 version 3 was a standard that was developed after V2, kind of a complicated standard with lots and lots of ways to express everything in the healthcare space, but it was kind of complicated. CDA is really, I believe, primarily the only standard, the only implementation guide that's really very actively used based on the V3 standard. And built on that is C-CDA R2.1 implementation guides and the prior C-CDA ones, and then the companion guide on top of that where USCDI is developed and designed. We have V1, the USCDI version 1 is represented in companion guide release 2. V2 is in release 3, and V3 is in C-CDA companion guide release 4.1, which is the corollary to 6.0.1 or 6.1 in US Core. And that also was published in June of 2023. And in fact, and just so to clarify, this guide also contains the data and the design for V1 and V2. This is what the current implementation guide looks like, the 4.1 implementation guide that has USCDI V3, bunch of PDF guides and a README file, and the README file points to where the sample files, so the XML files, are housed in a GitHub repository. These are supplementary to the C-CDA guide, which is 1,000 pages, and these are also approaching that amount. And again, we have two versions, one that has sort of the narrative guidance, and then the appendix A and B that have the computable templates in them. Appendix A covers the USCDI V1 through 3, and then Appendix B covers the USCDI UDI related UDI related data elements, which are unique device identifiers that are, and there's a way to represent them in both CDA and US Core. So these are the data elements and classes added in V3 and represented in that PDF. And similar to the standards advancement process, recognizing US Core 6.1, why it also recognizes CDA 4.1 as an alternative way to send around the USCDI data elements. Now it comes some exciting stuff. We are in the middle of, well, actually we're fairly nearing the deadlines to submit to ballot in both US Core and C-CDA. And something different this year is that C-CDA will be balloted for the first time since 2015. Now, there's been, many of you probably know that there's been errata packages since then, but the whole thing hasn't been re-balloted since 2015. So lots of enhancement requests were present. We errata packages are to cover mistakes, as you can imagine, but enhancements you're not allowed to do unless you reballot. And so that we've incorporated that, and pulling in all the USCDI stuff, data elements, and then in addition adding the new V4. There's a link here, and these slides, by the way, will be shared within the coming weeks. And so there's links that will be useful to you. For example, this goes to actually the new build that we're preparing for ballot. This new build is in a web format similar to how the FHIR IGs are published. So we're finally getting into the modern world. Why are we doing this? Well, as I hinted to before, the PDF publications are large and unwieldy, so much so that we've resisted doing a reballot of C-CDA. And we're, in addition, we want to get an underlying tech stack across HL7. And so V2 to some degree is also looking towards doing a structured definition type of publication. We would like to have the similar look and feel across all of the standards. And it inherently, there's a more logical versioning style. Ours is essentially manual, just adding dates basically on the end of template IDs. And and it will from our perspective, it will also ease updates, even though right now it's actually quite a bit more work. But after this year, the updates will be much easier. And there's also some inherent validation. Now, both of these things, and is something we're working on, and will probably change over the coming years and get enhanced over the coming years. But before we do publish in say about May of next year, we will have a validation style that is available for the industry to use. That's different than schematron. Okay. Excuse me. In addition, or as an opportunity, when we're now going to be balloting C-CDA R3, we're reorganizing it, streamlining it a bit. We are eliminating or adding templates or profiles. Well, they're templates, but they look like profiles if you're also used to looking at US Core, but they really are templates. Where needed to mirror US Core or for industry use and lack of use. We know we had a very outdated guide in there called the Diagnostic Imaging Report. Not to say we're not doing radiology report. Not that we don't have the ability to still communicate radiology results, but there was a whole document that was very, very much out of date. And so that one is not being brought forward. And there's other projects that will be addressing that issue anyway within the FHIR space. And these also are not going away, but these standards are still available at HL7 and within the different implementation guides that were previously published. And then in addition to that, we're bringing all the USCDI design in and adding the USCDI version for new design and mappings and proceeding with this web publication. This is what it looks like, and I'm sure before I'm done or in the last sort of session of this tech forum session, we'll be able to take a walk through the guide, just kind of like Brett did in US Core. You can see it's very similar in style. our signal for C-CDA though is that it's a red ribbon header, a green ribbon header instead of the red ribbon header, and it has a home page and main topics above here. And we did, by the way, publish a draft guide of this, which is reflected exactly C-CDA 2.1 in the structured definition publication of C-CDA. And so some of the things you'll see here, actually, these ribbons will be changing. We're mostly done actually with all the USCDI design. And by done, I mean the draft version that will go into ballot. There'll be some changes over the next few weeks. One of the big changes that we're working on right now is incorporating and adjusting the guidance text, which right now, this information has all of the narrative text we brought in from C-CDA, and this has additional guidance has all the narrative text from the companion guide. Why we have to merge and edit and deduplicate these two sets of pages that are on here. And so that's where a lot of the bulk of the work is occurring now over the next couple of weeks before we put it out for a pre-publication preview and then for ballot. Talk a little bit about C-CDA R3 and USCDI v4. These are the new data elements in v4, USCDI v4. And to talk a little bit, this design approach really is kind of applicable to both the US core design and C-CDA design. Again, the teams are cross-pollinated, and our first step is understanding the process, reviewing definitions of the USCDI definitions, trying to understand the policy intent for healthcare change. What's the purpose? Because that helps us to model it properly. We also want to learn what vendors are capturing now and how they capture it. And we also determine what is already defined in standards. And then we begin our mapping analysis to FHIR within FHIR US core and in CDA and C-CDA. The way we work it is we primarily focus on US core design first, and then we use those learnings both of the design discussions and application from FHIR to C-CDA. Conceptually they're very similar. FHIR has a lot more of the elements that are inherent in the standard that C-CDA has to use additional vocabulary bindings with to get that sort of same representation. And so it's really quite similar from a technical design standard. If you have your head in both spaces, it's similar. And from there, then we propose the designs iteratively. Some are straightforward, people have no questions, and they're happy with how the designs that are proposed. And other times we have to revisit, and then revisit again in ballot. And we build the draft US corporate files and CDA templates, and as we're doing now, and then in another month or so, we will be submitting to ballot. And during part of that process, we have open calls in both work groups. One is called for US core. We work within the HL7 work group called Cross Projects Work Group, and in C-CDA, it's called the Structured Documents Work Group. They're open; anyone can attend. It's not closed. The more people that we have participate, the better. So we always welcome people, and it's always open. And then we prepare the ballot version. And I wanted to walk through a couple of highlights of the USCDI v4 and how their application and representation in C-CDA. For ones that are for data elements these are the data elements that are already existing either in the companion guide or C-CDA. And for those, we will just be flagging them. And we're using now a similar process to what Brett showed you in US core, where you have a little USCDI flag that again also now is in the structure definition and not just a UI thing. And so again, can be used for them to query for testing and whatnot. So the items you see here: substance encounter, medication instructions, performance time, facility information, laboratory, that portion of the laboratory bits, those were already existing in one of the existing templates, and we will just highlight them as USCDI. Here's an example of procedure performance time within our procedure template. You see here, that's how, there's some items that are above here, which we'll see, take a look at later. We have procedure, and then we have effective time here. And this is then flagged with USCDI, and also has the wordings of from USCDI, which is performance time. In some instances, I mentioned before, there was another style of template where actually it's mostly there. It's just some vocabulary narrowing that we have to do. And an example of that is our alcohol use and substance use. We will be using the existing assessment scale and assessment scale supporting observation templates that have been in CDA for many, many years, and add vocabulary bindings and or vocabulary guidance. In some cases, we will not necessarily do a direct binding, but we might display or have a page of value sets available for use for the specific use cases, alcohol and substance use. And these value sets, by the way, are value sets that were developed from the Gravity project. And we are developing guidance pages that is going to be very similar to what US Core has had. We've had it in Companion Guide, we've had it in US Core, and now we're going to be publishing so that they look as similar as they can be given the different underlying standards. Some new templates we'll be creating are something called treatment intervention preference, care experience preference, physical activity, and details around specimen. Now, we have had the ability to represent specimen in some supplemental guides, but they will be new for C-CDA, and so we will be adding them, and we have added them, built them, and are reusing the vocabulary that's been around for quite some time in V2. Medication adherence and average blood pressure are two other new templates. Some examples. This is care experience preference. You can see it's very similar look and feel to what you'll see in FHIR. Again, it's still the same. I don't know if I emphasize enough before, actually, that it's still CDA. It's not FHIR. It's still based on underlying standard, even though we also had to develop a logical model, structure definition logical model of the underlying CDA standard. But it is just to make sure everyone knows it's still CDA. XML is going to go over the wire as documents. So we have a description up here of what the template is, and then we have the vocabulary bindings. We have, in this case, and it's very often text is what would be in the clinical world, what would be captured. And so we just have a code that says a LOINC code that is care experience preference, and are describing how text can be captured, because in most cases this is going to be in the patient's words. And in the CDA case, this can be contained in any location. CCDA are what we call open templates, and they which means you can put templates in pretty much any location that you think is appropriate for your implementation. It could go in an advanced directive section, or even entries within an advanced directive section, and also procedure activity and or social history section and entries within them. Another new item that we're adding is something called medication adherence, and in the CDA case, this will be basically it will be an observation. Again, the primary difference, so it's just observation class. We've clarified what this type of observation is, which is adherence to prescribed medication instructions, and then we have a value set of medication adherence terms, which are that we actually have some other unknown values in here. This is at the moment, we're still working a little bit on this value set to make sure we've got the terms that the industry feels comfortable with. But at the time the slides were developed, this is what the value set is. And we're having a grouping set with additional data absent reason terms in it. So there'll be some additional ones of those. And this is in the CDA case is contained inside the medication activity template. And so you can see that from the medication activity template, which I don't show you the top of here, but it is pointed to from medication activity in here. So this then clicks to the medication adherence. Thanks to Brett, we are creating this groovy template, groovy table that will, just like in US Core, link. These will link. This is the USCDI data element, and then this is a link that goes directly to the CDA template where that element is represented, and then as we have seen before, the items within that are described to be included in the USCDI data element will be flagged with the CDI. And so meeting coordinates, if you're wanting to join up at the last and in the final steps towards ballot, we have some these are the schedule for the remaining time. We have a review of draft designs that will be going over some open issues. I think we have some open issues we'll be dealing with. Around the 17th, we'll be posting the guide for what we call pre-ballot QA or community QA. And we have to have submitted all of the final content by December 4th. And don't forget to sign up for both. Now this is the ballot time is coming up. You need to, and I don't think the sign up is open yet, but you need to be sure to sign up by just before Christmas, 12/21, and the ballot comment period is 12/8 to 1/8. And the coordinates are on the left here for joining structured documents discussions. I think that's it. Oops. This is what we do all year, as described earlier.
There, you missed a chatter about you turning into a princess and me into a prince, so maybe we'll have to add.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have a little bit of time here. I think one of the questions, looking at the proposed agenda here, was to spend a little bit of time talking about design session updates going on HL7. I don't know, Gabe, do you want to spend 5 minutes talking about C-CDA or have me jump into US Core and take a break?
No, I'm happy to. Let me just, I had mentioned that I maybe walk through the IG as it exists right now a little bit, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Great.
So we saw this on a screenshot on the slides, and we have, as I mentioned, we've got, the home page again. Everything's having to be edited to make it appropriate for both sort of today's state of the industry, as well as correcting references and things like that. Obviously not talking about 2.1 since this is 3.0. We have this all is information that's retrieved from volume 1 of C-CDA, and this area is the information from the companion guide, and the introduction, understanding, and USCD guidance and USCDI table are going to be very much different, and they're incorporated into what will be the guidance, what is called guidance up here now, or will be hopefully by the end of next week. And the document level guidance, section level guidance, and this is actually, we're calling this entry level guidance because it is primarily focused on the entries, will be staying essentially the same, except for updating references to like from 2.1 to 3.0, et cetera, that sort of thing, just kind of a tech edit on those things. But it all will be merged under general guidance. And also the assessments that you find currently in here, assessment, SDOH assessment and screening, it will be its own page, similar to as it is in US Core. And then artifact index is where you find all the different templates that are currently existing. And this does include the USCDI data elements that were new and updated. And as you can see here, these are all the document level templates. And then section level templates. And then down further are the entries. And below that are the what we call sub entries or supplement. I forget now what they're actually called. But the templates like address that have to be stuck inside another template to make any sense. So let's just take a look at allergy for a second. So here is what's called logical model now, but it still is as a CDA template. Excuse me. And you can see on this page that where is just like you had the containment tables in the old PDF publications, what we have something similar here is that it resides within the Allergy Concern Act or the Health Concern Act and the Risk Concern Act. And if we would click on allergy concern, you can see on allergy concern, the representation of allergy concern, and then even going up more, allergy intolerance section. And then where does allergy intolerance, where is it currently used? Again, not that it can't be used other places, but currently as defined, it's used in the consult note, CCD, discharge summary, history and physical, procedure note, progress note, referral note, and transfer summary. So then if we go down and you navigate here, you can see that this section contains Allergy Concern Act. This Allergy Concern Act contains the allergy intolerance observation. And then the observation has all the details. You'll see that we currently have retained some of there's some things we've had to work out. The ID, there's an internal ID of these that is new that the structured definite publication uses for its validation from a technical perspective behind the scenes. However, we are adding another ID. The other ID will be where the template IDs that, if you're familiar with CDA, currently reside. So the ID and then the extension of when it was last changed. And then things that are new will have, I think we're putting down a June or May of 2023. And then going forward, we're going to be, beyond that, we'll be addressing when and how long we need to retain those different extensions. And let's see, what else to show you while I was here that I didn't already talk about. You'll see some of the items that we in USCDI that right now the guidance is we have a USCDI table, which is the table we're showing, and that links out. These all link out to the different profiles. We also have this USCDI guidance, separate pages that is mostly, it's going to now be a little bit outdated. The guidance from these pages that are what we have called in the PDF additional guidance will actually be incorporated if needed into the profile. So you won't have two places you have to look. It's just going to be the table. Click on the template, and then within that template, you will see where the USCDI data elements are. Anything else you suggest that I show Brett before I have a coughing fit?
No, I think that's really good. I can show a quick view of the Jira dashboards where issues are reported and managed if you don't have that handy.
Great. Well, yeah, I'll go ahead and stop sharing then.
Okay. So this is a little bit more flex here. So just so folks know in the background here, and I can put HL7 is the overseeing body of these standards. And so we do have kind of several dashboards of issues that come in here for folks to get a taste of what's going on. So, C-CDA's 445 does not accurately represent all the trackers because we didn't have this tool before. I know there's thousands of trackers at C-CDA over time. But the idea of, if you've ever used a Jira, anybody can log a Jira tracker. You can hit create and go through the workflow. But in here, we actively work through these on structured documents. I didn't pick any in particular one, but there may be clarification on value sets or improvement in design. But again, everything is tracked and voted and maintained. And there's dashboards here for US Core also. And so I guess US Core over the last several years has always been in Jira. And so there's been kind of 1,500 issues logged against the standard. And we are working towards this January ballot. So for folks, if you want to pencil in some time at the end of the year when it's quiet, they will open kind of mid-December to first week of January. You can let us know ahead of time now if you see anything to fix, but that's the kind of formal voting period. So just like your elections are opening next week for local, these are opening a month later. Just a little bit on the US Core design side of the house here. The way we have run it, and again, Eric is probably out hiding somewhere. Eric Hawes, tip of the hat in terms of doing the initial designs on HackMD. And so the way I kind of think of it is like it starts very informal, and then as we get the year progresses, it gets more formal and formal. And so our approach has been through the Argonaut project, direct engagement with vendors and providers is to kind of, I don't say it's not a whiteboard session, but it kind of is like a, let's put up how to enable the USCDI elements, data classes and elements. And so you'll see, in terms of allergies, there's not a huge amount of excitement here because the request was surf substance, non-medication. And we'd actually had support for that in prior releases. And so it's just adding guidance to make it clear in USCDI, here's how you support that. It's in the US Core Allergy Intolerance Code, and making sure, and I shouldn't say we already support it. We always make sure to have someone review the value sets to make sure that they do in fact cover what was required. And so there's a page for each of them. And we go back and forth, and there was a comment and kind of question and answer about how much do vendors drive versus providers. The question was more of vendors clearly have an input in the standards process, as do patient advocates, as do providers, as do government folks. And the thing that's tricky in standards development for folks who spend a lot of time there is, standards folks they're wonderful. They have idealistic views of the way the world should be. And I think what's tricky about it sometimes is there's a bit of optimism on what is possible. And it's very important to stretch the industry and to push in new areas to make sure we're closing the gaps on social care and closing the gaps in cases that may not get closed in their own kind of private market space that we would want them to. And so it's important to have the government function to push that. But it's also really important to make sure that the standard that goes with it can actually meet that need. And so it's collaboration with the kind of policy side, maybe pulling folks along in some cases, or maybe folks shouldn't even say pulling. There are some vendors who are far ahead in doing some of the social care work, and so they are already happy to share the work they've done. And so it's just kind of this balancing act to try to figure out, making sure a standard is clear, can get implemented, and can solve, the kind of maybe the potential policy issue, or even the thing a particular vendor's customer is asking for. And so there's always kind of a mix of folks pulling on the standards process. And so each of these pages is, again, I put these pages in chat, but at this point, we've moved beyond these pages because these were just kind of scratched boards. But you can see, when we went through all of the new kind of specimen result requirements, mapping to, where the new spots were in terms of, adding specimen source site identifier. We had a lot of conversations about what specimen condition acceptability meant, and ONC provides some very nice clarification to improve this. And there are some here we're still struggling with. And so if you want to join us on a call next Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern, medication adherence, and what Gabe mentioned on the C-CDA side, but in the US Core side, we've had a lot of struggle about How do you capture medication adherence depending on different care settings? We know that, in the outpatient, patient comes in and reports whether they've been consuming or not. There's ways to track that in kind of the outpatient record. But in the inpatient hospital setting, what's the expectation around the medication administration record of, what part of that should be exposed and what's appropriate to be exposed. And so those conversations are ongoing as we prep for ballot. So we kind of start with this page, and again, some of you might not be surprised, but some of you would be the amount of conversation on, something like facility type or identifier, what that actually means, can generate a fair bit of conversation. And everything at HL7 is tracked. Just to, again, I'll give you a few links here too to understand, HL7 uses Confluence to manage their projects. And the current best spot to see the activity is in this thing called, we're in this particular group called the cross group projects. It's just HL7 has all these different work groups like, patient care and fire infrastructure and structured documents, but cross group project runs it. And on here is a page where we're kind of marching to ballot. And all these designs have been migrated to the build site. Oops, that's the FHIR build site. Let's go here. And so the way you're on the build site is it starts with build.fhir.org. And so this is kind of the drafty page under construction. Again, the history page where you can find the fixed releases. But on that build page, you'll see a fair bit of effort is done to say, hey, this is under construction. And the team has done, primarily Eric has done a ton of work to try to call out specific changes that are in flight. A few I might highlight that I think folks might find interesting. We've talked a lot. I'm trying to find the chat here. Let me put this in the chat here. That's the link to the page. So on this page, we've done a ton to improve the must support guidance. We're looking at US Core smart scopes this release. And so instead of just saying, getting a resource level scope to say you have access to the condition resource or the laboratory resource, or observation. There's no such thing as a laboratory resource, observation. Actually giving kind of the additional scope. So you're only giving authorization to someone who can download, just have access to things that are categorized as laboratory, or just things that are even categorized as a specific, is vital sign or a specific type of. We don't have specific type of vital sign in here, but there's potentials in the way the smart authorization works that someone could give a token that only allows that app to grab that specific thing. And so we're trying to improve some of that access in this particular release. And we're hoping to get a lot of feedback on this. This is something that's been kind of, interest has grown in this over time, as mentioned in the HGI1 about granular access. And this is an attempt to respond and give clear guidance around that. And there's some good guidance in the smart spec, but as we know, smart spec's an international spec, and we want to make sure it's really tight on what folks are going to implement. Another page I think folks might not be aware of, and we'll see if this makes it through ballot. I'm optimistic it will. Is the Argonaut project did a FHIR write effort this year on how to share data back to the EHR. And before anyone pops the champagne, we focused specifically on FHIR write for vital signs. We have had other industry efforts in the past to say, hey, let's enable FHIR write with EHRs. And we've kind of gotten bogged down on the idea of writing anything back to the EHR, from the idea of maybe providers don't want something written back, and what are the workflows once a patient does write it back. And there's a lot of swirl that comes with that area. And so this year we made an agreement, we would just work on FHIR write for vital signs. And so right now we have a page that's in the spec provisionally that provides a full set of guidance for how to share back vital sign observations with a provider. And one particular use case of that is for home monitoring. A lot of feedback on some basic things like blood pressure or blood sugar levels, getting blood pressure back to the provider being a big deal. And blood sugar, and that's a whole future thing. I mean to jump to. But there's a whole set of guidance on this page that, if successful through ballot this year, again, it's in the futures page, but the idea of like, this is an on-ramp to including some right guidance directly into the US core specifications. We are continuing to improve the screening and assessments guidance. So this was originally was born out of social determinants of health and how you handle the variety of assessment instruments that are out there. We don't want to design a spec that only meets one. We want to design kind of foundational capabilities that can be rearranged to meet a whole set. And so when physical activity, alcohol use, and substance use were added, we kind of gave this another look to see how to improve the guidance on this page. One of the things that we're still wrestling a little bit with is, how much guidance do we give on starter sets in terms of these screens assessments. The idea of, someone able to make a clinical judgment that someone has a specific need, but trying to give kind of pointers to terminology, and hopefully through ballot, we can harden this particular area up a bit. Think of other guidance in here. There is this changes between versions. Folks may not have seen this before, where we talk about, when something was added, potentially big changes. This gives you a nice high-level view, and there is actually a comparison feature here. This is courtesy of the HL7 FHIR publisher. Again, thank Dan Freeman and Graham Grieve and others. They're continually improving the publication process at HL7. You may not be able to find all the features because they're coming fast and furious, but you can click here and then you can actually go through and see, hey, what changed, and potentially breaking. And you'll look at some of these and it's like, it's not quite breaking. The definitions are still improving, but it gives you a quick view of what's going on in the specification. To go with the change log, the change between versions, there's a very detailed change log, and this is something that every single FHIR spec is working towards. But you'll see every single tracker that was submitted in ballot that we mark applied gets added to this page. And so for folks who've submitted a tracker and want to see it, the approach is, and we're in this right now, the list of things that we're working on right now is resolved, kind of change required, error, cause, or I will implement, or someone else, and then there's a kind of flag to QA. So a multi-step process here where then Gay or I or someone else goes and reviews, or we ask the commenter to confirm that we've gotten what they wanted changed, correctly changed. So there's a bit of rigmarole to, some redundant, some double checking to make sure everything here, again, accurately reflects not what the commenter wanted, but what the committee agreed to. So that's all in the change log, and we've been, I think this has been pretty solid from 3.1.1 onwards. FHIR artifacts, I think, you can see all the list of profiles, everything that's new or has significant updates. So diagnostic report for laboratory result reporting has been around for a long time, as has encounter and immunizations. But when we made edits to the profile pages, they've been flagged as green. Search parameters operations, I don't know. This is just kind of a formalization of what the search parameters are. Terminology, this lists all the value sets, and most recently, there's been an addition here for the value set URIs using the US core, which link up to VSAC. Someone did make a comment that linking to VSAC is problematic, and I agree. When you first log in here, unfortunately there is a paywall, and I shouldn't say a paywall. It's really more of they're trying to be careful about the license agreements with the underlying code systems. But in your browser, if you can save your API key, oh my gosh, did this just not? This was the actual. Let me go a different way. That was actually to a call for the resource. But if you were to go to, that was a way to call and retrieve the actual discrete value set. If I go here and click, vaccine administered value set, this links directly to the VSAC page, and so it provides that list. A little slow, might be my internet, might be the connection of the web session here, but once this loads up, this is the API key again. Hopefully after this, it'll stop asking, depending on your browser. But then you can see the concepts that are included in this case using CVX. And then you have the ability to export this value set and import it into your system for development. Go back here. Oh, we do include the timeline, so that was in a slide. You'll see that here. There's a little bit on security. We're a little light, and I shouldn't say we're light. We reference other specifications. We don't try to redefine or rework security in here. We rely on other parts of the FHIR spec to do that. There is a summary of all the examples. These examples are worked into the profile pages, but this is just kind of a catch-all of all of them. There's the downloads and changelog. So that's just a quick tour of the spec for folks who haven't. I don't know, those are things that jump out to me. I would say 99% of the time I open the spec, I'm going to profiles and extensions. I'm going to my specific profile. And this feature of, I would say I'd probably use more than most, where I'm trying to say, hey, what did we change or what questions you have? You can just quickly flip between versions. That's very handy. So that's it. I'll take a pause and look at the Q&A and see if others. So should developers ever use the build.FHIR page to stay ahead of the official published RG, or should developers primarily focus on the official published version? That's a great question. I think if 6.10 covers the requirement, so if you're working on USCDI version 3, I would say I would stick to 6.1.0. But if you're trying to do something new in USCDI version 4 that is not in 6.1.0, the only place to see that is in the build site. So I peek at it, but I think until it goes to ballot, I would, unless you're on the calls and hearing kind of the potential pending design changes, I don't think I would do a ton of development to the build site. I think in these next things are pretty well stable in terms of prep for ballot, but I would say only if you're really trying to drive to a specific part of the USCDI version 4 would I build off of the build site. Okay, with that, so I see another question here. Many providers have different types of applications, such as, and a few vendors are listed here: Epic, Meditech, Oracle, and public health to develop their own data systems. How does HL7 FHIR fit compatible with those systems for interoperability? Great question. For Epic and Meditech, and for those who are becoming certified health IT systems, they are required to produce they're required to support the US Core guide. And so when I say that, if you are going to retrieve an allergy from a certified health IT system, and you were to look at, let's just say, an example here, the expectation is you would get a JSON payload which starts with allergy intolerance, would have an actual ID that's for that particular, system. And then, in this case, it would, have the kind of corresponding requirements that are inside the profile. Clinical status of active, it was confirmed, it has a criticality of high. And so the EHR would be able to produce, or the certified health IT would be able to produce a JSON or XML payload. Actually, JSON is a requirement in the spec, according to the requirements on this profile page. And for public health agencies and others, there are some public health guides that have been developed through HL7 that some agencies can then require as part of their programs. That's the idea. And to go with this, the fun part about not just having these profiles, but is the testing tools that go with it, that you can actually take an instance and run it through a test tool to confirm that what the system produced is valid JSON per the profile. Okay. That, I think, is a quick tour of US Core and a little bit about design sessions. So in USCDI version 4, we do, if you were to look at this table, is updated with the US. Of course, I would say I'm on live. I was gonna say, oh no, why does it say USCDI too? But okay, so let's get to the build version here. Let's go here, build version USCDI. And so the USCDI version 4 are now on this page. So any of the new elements you want to look at are available and referenced from here today, and will be in the formal ballot in a few weeks. So with that, I'll pause. I'll hand it back to our Gay, if you have any comments to make, otherwise you can hand it back to our hosts.
Yeah, just back to those. I think that'd be great, unless people have specific questions.
So hi, this is Carmela again. We'll give it about 30 seconds to see if someone enters another question in the chat or in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll end a little bit early. Thank you, Gay. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Scott and Aaron and Al. Very comprehensive overview of USCDI and US Core certification. C-CDA was great. And I'll just say it out loud because a bunch of questions have come over in the chat. Yes, the slides and the recording and the Q&A transcript will be available on healthit.gov within the next couple of weeks. All right, I'm not seeing any new questions. So thank you everybody for attending, and we'll end it there.
Yeah, come join us and comment in ballot.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great,
Thank you,
thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.